Who doesn't know the cult classic from 2004? Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is still considered one of the best RPGs ever made. Like everyone else, back in the day I played it alongside a bunch of technical problems that constantly surrounded that title, and yet I kept playing anyway. You don't often come across such incredible quality of role-playing depth and just brilliant game concepts. I think most of you are familiar with the game one way or another, so there's no need to advertise it. What always surprised me though was the complete absence of a sequel. At some point we finally got a glance of hope for a continuation, but the development of this problematic sequel was wrapped in so much drama that it's honestly hard to describe it in words. I can't even remember when the last time a game went through such a ridiculous amount of trouble. Let me briefly run through the key points. In 2015, Paradox Interactive bought White Wolf, the company that owned the rights to Bloodlines. That's the same developer and publisher, mostly known for their grand strategy games and for adding dozens, if not hundreds, of DLCs to their products. And that was the first bad omen, because even though most of their games are solid, their business model always clashes with the wallets of players. Not long after the acquisition, development of the sequel was handed to Hardsuit Labs, since the original developer, Troika Games, had long since dissolved. Then came a chain of release delays, and by the second time, in July 2020, 2 creative directors were dismissed, including Brian Mitsoda, the writer of the original game. Even to this day, Paradox has never really explained that decision. That same year, Chris Avellone was also fired due to allegations of sexual misconduct, accusations he has relatively recently disproved in court. A year later, in 2021, Paradox decided to switch developers entirely and handed the project to the Chinese room. There were even rumors that they wanted to cancel the whole thing altogether. Obviously, all previous progress was scrapped, and development practically started from the beginning. After that, there were even more reshuffles, changes and delays. And when this long-suffering game finally began to see some light at the end of the tunnel, Paradox decided to lock 2 clans behind paid DLC. Why am I not surprised? Thankfully, after a wave of criticism, they've cancelled that decision. It's pretty clear that nothing remains of the original vision of being a full-fledged sequel to the cult classic. They threw away everything and went in a direction that nobody really understands. Honestly, I would never have bought this game if I weren't making a video about it. Before starting the playthrough, I prayed to every god that the second game would be at least average, not even good, just something average that could bring some sort of enjoyment. If you've seen the trailers, then you know the only things to expect were either a mediocre clone of Dishonored or a slightly better Redfall. And those who've heard about this masterpiece, which also came with its own pile of drama, already get the picture. Everyone else shouldn't even waste their time. So I started my playthrough with the lowest possible expectations. Let's try to figure out together whether I was right or if I was wrong. Let's start with the technical side of things. Strangely enough, this one actually has kinda decent system requirements, which, to be fair, make total sense. It's been in development for ages and was most likely originally built for previous generation of consoles and hardware. With DLSS enabled at 2K resolution, the game runs quite well. I'm getting a stable 110-120 FPS. Without DLSS, that number drops to around 80. I'll display my hardware specs and ultra settings on screen. Overall, media have complained about the game's technical side, but honestly, I think even weaker rigs will be able to run this sequel fairly well. I didn't experience any major FPS drops, and the game itself doesn't really demand high-end hardware. It will run even on older graphics cards. The real question is, does anyone even want it? What does ruin the experience, though, are the stutters. I've seen plenty of reviews where this particular issue got a lot of attention. It seems on my setup things run a bit smoother. Yes, there were stutters, but nowhere near as bad as what some specialized reviewers reported. What really surprised me was the lack of HDR support. I can't even remember the last time I played a game with such washed out colors. It honestly felt like I was gaming on my old monitor again. That's an instant downside for me. As for bugs, surprisingly across 10 hours of playtime, I didn't encounter anything serious aside from one crash. I did notice plenty of small quirks like floating props here and there, but to be fair, I was actively looking for them, so you decide for yourself how serious those technical issues really are. Now onto the visuals. The supposed good optimization has a pretty simple explanation. It's outdated. The new developers apparently scrapped everything the original studio made, but the graphics don't look just outdated for 2025. They would look dated even for 2020. Sure, the game has its fair share of beautiful moments and some neat visual touches, which I'll get into later, but to be fair, even if this came out in the late 2010s, it still wouldn't have been impressive. A few examples: blurry textures, baked in lighting, although sometimes quite pretty, repetitive NPC models that look cloned, a total lack of cars on the roads, and surfaces that react weirdly to light sources. If there's a lamp or a streetlight nearby, character skin can either reflect an odd color or calculate lighting incorrectly. I'm no rendering expert, but it seems like they messed up the PBR, because when you look at characters' faces in darker areas during dialogue scenes or cutscenes, everything suddenly looks much better. Why they decided to bake all the lighting and not use any dynamic lighting at all, that's the real question. It also could be said about the physics system. It technically exists. There's ragdoll and some basic environmental interaction, but there's so little of it. Bodies become static just after a few seconds, and interaction with the environment happens almost exclusively with selected highlighted objects. That wouldn't be a big problem if the game didn't feature telekinesis and powers built around interacting with the environment. I mean, who cares about realistic ragdoll physics like Euphoria from GTA 4 in an economic strategy game? But here, damn it, that's a core part of the gameplay. When you combine this flaw with the baked lighting, the illusion of a pleasant-looking world immediately collapses. You just walk through a bunch of artificial boxes with no real interactivity. Even Control, which came out back in 2019, handled these aspects far better. Or more recent Dying Light the Beast. That game easily knocks Bloodlines out of the ring. So the more technical side of the visuals is pretty rough. But if we ignore these downsides, overall the game still has a certain charm. If you ignore the problems, purely from an aesthetic standpoint, the game really does remind me of the 2004 original. It carries the same vibes of brutality, darkness, and even sexuality. One of the main highlights of the first game, at least for me personally, was its insanely good facial animation, especially for its time. And to be fair, while this sequel can be criticized for a lot, the developers did put real effort into this aspect. Maybe it's hard to call it next gen, but watching the characters' facial expressions during dialogues is extremely satisfying, just like in the good old days. Also, I've got to point out the character design, especially the female characters. Most of them look great, beautiful, and, I'm not afraid to say it, sexy. All in the line with the traditions of the original Bloodlines. As I mentioned before, when the characters appear in the right lighting during cutscenes or dialogues, they're honestly a joy to look at. And speaking of lighting, ignoring the baked, static look, the game's atmosphere overall isn't bad at all. Neon signs, unnaturally bright colors, the play of light and shadow, all of this creates the distinct mystical vibe. That said, the city itself feels absolutely generic. Just the same repeating skyscrapers and back alleys. Reviewers also had noted the interiors, and I have to agree. Yes, the levels are filled with completely static objects, but they're at least put together with attention to detail. As for the level design itself, there's a decent amount of verticality, but I'll talk more about that in the gameplay section. The animations also left a good impression. Nothing groundbreaking, but combat feels dynamic, hits have weight, and the game provides clear feedback. There are even finishing moves, kind of like in the newer Doom games. As for the interface, I have mostly positive impressions. The icons are stylized, the special mode has clear color separation, there are reasonable hints and important places or objects are highlighted properly. It's comfortable and pleasant to play, and the game shows information well. What I don't like are the text boxes. They look cheap, like the default Unreal Marketplace preset, and while the icons are stylish, it's often completely unclear what each ability actually does. You have to read to figure it out. Overall, Bloodlines 2 can generate its own kind of vibe and atmosphere, but it's constantly held back by an obviously outdated technical foundation. No matter how much you try to ignore it, the game simply lacks detail. Better lighting, more people on the streets, cars, minimal object physics, barely any interaction with the environment, all of that breaks the pleasant immersion that the game does manage to create in other moments. You exist inside an artificial box, and somewhere inside there is a great art style that is well hidden. Now, when it comes to sound, surprisingly, I have the least complaints. You won't believe it, but the overall musical tone is almost identical to the first game. At first, the original composer, Rick Schaffer, was actually working with the initial dev team on the soundtrack. He even made a remix of the main theme. Later, the studio supposedly dropped him, but according to the developer diaries on the publisher's website, they actually integrated his tracks into the work of other composers. One of the strangest decisions imaginable. Fine, maybe Paradox didn't like the original studio, but what does the composer have to do with that? Regardless, they tried to recreate the atmosphere that the first game's soundtrack had, and honestly, they pulled it off. Of course, not without Schaffer's influence. Maybe it lacks a few standout tracks, like those electronic club bangers. Yes, I'm talking about Chasm Isolated. But the ambient and instrumental general themes are quite good, and overall, both the dialogues and the sound design are solid. Everything meshes well together and creates a great impression. Combat sounds punchy, and the voice work is pleasant to listen to. Maybe the audio team wasn't bothered as much as the others, so they were actually able to do their job. Who knows? But once again, your ears will have a great time with this sequel. I'll show a few examples and then we'll move on to the gameplay.
Like they were nothing. Fat lot of good.
Nomad of many faces. What do you call yourself now?
Fire.
Then I'm simply beside myself to meet you.
When it comes to gameplay, give me the drum roll. I turned out to be right. It's a mediocre, Dishonored clone. But that's not even the shocking part. The game has no weapons. None at all. You can't use melee or firearms. Technically, weapons exist. Enemies use them, but all you can do is lift them with telekinesis, then fire off a few rounds and toss them away. Right, why bother implementing real combat when you can just save on animations? It's the kind of cringe and poor taste I haven't seen in years. And the problem isn't even that we're fighting with bare hands and some magic. It's the total lack of indirect progression. In most games, even in the first Bloodlines, you could feel your character's growth through both weapons and abilities. Here, there are only two RPG elements: new spells and the way other characters treat you based on dialogue choices. Oh, and a bit of customization, if anyone still counts that as the role-playing feature. That's it. Combat isn't terrible, but it gets boring way too fast. Excluding traditional weaponry is one of the worst design decisions I've seen in action game in at least a decade. But okay, let's talk about positive aspects. The first game technically had an open world, but I really never took it as one. It was just a handful of areas you could move between, until the story unlocked new ones. The sequel actually gives you more freedom. You're released into a large, by original standards, city and can move around however you want. And surprisingly, that part works really well. In classic Dishonored fashion, you can jump over obstacles, pull yourself up, but now there are added vampiric abilities. Your character can run up walls, bounce off them, climb pipes, and even glide. Strangely enough, movement here feels genuinely fun and fluid. I can't say it's more exciting than Arkham Knight or Spider-Man, but it's still engaging. The downside, the city itself is completely dull. As I mentioned in visual section, it's just identical skyscrapers and same looking back alleys. There is verticality, sure, but it's rarely plays into actual gameplay, mostly in a few scripted story encounters. Otherwise, you're just running back and forth with no real purpose. And even when you randomly stumble across a few anarchists, there's nothing meaningful you can actually do with that. Now, what about the clan system and character customization? At the start, you pick your gender, and about an hour in, you get to choose your clan. There are 6 available at the moment, and the most interesting part, it barely affects gameplay. Each clan has a main skill tree with 6 abilities, 4 active, 2 passive. The final row unlocks a few specific upgrades. Everything else can be learned as you progress. So technically, you get unique clan bonuses and can mix in certain skills from others. But practically, since there are no weapons and combat or stealth are basically the same for everyone, you can experience most of the game's abilities in a single playthrough. There is a decent variety of powers, some are cool, others feel trivial, and using them is fun. But there's the catch. There's no need to manage your blood meter, which acts like mana. In the sequel, powers consume blood charges. If a skill requires 2, you just need to feed twice. It's more of a cooldown mechanic than an actual resource system. Everything in this game is oversimplified to the extreme. Feeding during combat feels like glory kills from the newer Doom games. After feeding, you watch a short execution animation. Plenty of games have tried to replicate this kind of mechanic, but few have nailed it. Bloodlines 2 isn't one of them. And you know why? Because mechanics like this need to reward you. It should feel worth doing. In Doom, it gave you health and the animation lasted just a second. Here, while the animation looks flashy and doesn't take long, the big problem is that enemies can kill you while performing it. The moment you can't control your protagonist, enemies just beat you to death mid-animation. The second problem is that even the relatively wide variety of magic can't save the gameplay, because there's simply nothing else here. Talking about combat, it's just basic button mashing, a heavy strike and dodges. Talking about stealth, it's extremely simple with brain-dead AI. Talking about content, that's where things get really bad. There's a main storyline, some blood farming for leveling up, a few collectibles, and a handful of side quests in their absolute terrible form. You talk with a character, grab a quest, and then get one of 3 variations. Kill a single target, kill a group, or fetch bring something. That's it. No mysteries, no complex dialogue outside the main story. None of that. And to make matters worse, the game strips away even the element of exploration. Your reticle points out when you're near a secret, meaning in an already empty world, the game holds your hand and forces you to passively collect random writings from walls. Another idiotic design choice. Basically, there's nothing left here to show or tell that's remotely interesting. This is all the game currently has to offer. Honestly, this is the first time in a long while I felt no desire to keep playing. After just a short time with it, I'm already bored to death. The movement is fun, sure, but what's the point if there's no content to move through? Combat is painfully simple, if only there were at least some melee weapons to collect, or even a bit of variety variety in activities, but nope. The inventory, gone. You only have 4 types of potions. Abilities like lockpicking, also gone. All those elements were stripped away. Quests aren't properly written, violating the Masquerade doesn't even get punished, you just climb up to rooftops and cops forget you exist. There are a few spots with anarchists, but other than that, there's literally nothing to do, and you're left with the main storyline. And even this part is hard to comment on, because for nearly 5.5 hours, the game keeps you stuck in what's basically an extended tutorial. You can move around the city, sure, but as already said, there's nothing to do here. During those early hours, the story only starts to unravel. You're an elder vampire who's been dragged into Seattle and suddenly awakened. A detective, a Malkavian, accidentally finds you. You kill him and then he somehow ends up stuck in your head. Ironically, he serves as a sort of hint system, constantly explaining what's happening so the player doesn't accidentally finds out something on their own. Later you start having his dreams, where you walk around as him in the past and explore old crime scenes. To be fair, that's a cool concept and I do see the potential. Reviewers who got press copies said the story itself is pretty solid. The characters, surprisingly, are actually quite charismatic, but again, I couldn't care less about the story when the rest of the game is so empty. Even the original Bloodlines held your attention through unique aspects. The unusual setting, the constant feeling of danger and discovery, the weird situations and how the story blended naturally with the world. Here, sure, you still get to make choices, like whether you hand over a scumbag to the Camarilla or to the Anarchs. And so what? Cool, I guess. But then what? You show up, fight, listen to dialogue and move on. Despite all its attempts to seem engaging, after 10 hours I haven't a single standout moment. There's some mysterious mark, some restrictions, maybe it will open up later, but honestly I just don't care anymore. For a game where the story is the only real hook, it just isn't enough. I think the conclusion here is pretty clear. The game isn't exactly bad, it's just unfinished. With what we have now, you can't give it more than 6 out of 10 at best. And the issue isn't even just the lack of content, mechanics or technical polish. It's that none of this is likely to be fixed. The fact that the game even released after all this development hell is a miracle itself. But unlike more recent Stalker 2, which for all its issues still has massive player support, Bloodlines 2 probably won't get that lucky. The game's getting bad reviews and I honestly don't think they'll ever release 2 planned DLCs. They'll patch it a couple of times and call it a day. Realistically, the game needed at least another year in development, but the publisher got tired of funding it, so it was shoved out of the door. Predictable, given the chaos behind the scenes, but still sad. This is one of those rare cases when I can't recommend the game. At best, if they somehow don't abandon it and keep updating, maybe then it will be worth checking out someday. But for now, don't waste your time. Either replay the original or just play Dishonored.